A widow in 1888 Dakota Territory is digging a trench around her own house, packing mud and straw against the walls like armor. The neighbors laugh, especially Silas Mercer, the most powerful man for miles, who swears she's burying herself alive. But Elspeth isn't building for pride. She's building for survival, because the one-room school is reopening and the sky is too quiet to be safe. Then the blizzard hits without warning, and the school vanishes into white nothing. Only one thing stands between those children and death, a rope inside Elspeth's crazy tunnel. Stay until the end, because the man who mocked her will be found inside it. The shovel struck frozen ground like it meant to break it open. Elspeth Rowe paused only long enough to catch her breath, the frayed leather gloves stiff with old sweat and cracked across the knuckles. She had been digging a trench along the side of the house since sunrise, her skirt tucked unevenly into her boots, mud caked to the hem. The soil fought her, turning from frost to sludge with every blow. But she wasn't aiming for beauty. She was building armor, not for herself, but for the crooked little house that James had built with his own hands 7 years earlier, the same house that had trembled under his coffin as they carried him out. Now, in the winter of 1888, her grief had hardened into something angular and silent, and she packed it into every handful of straw and earth she slapped against the wood siding. It wasn't madness, though the town seemed convinced otherwise. Her father had told her once, long ago in County Mayo, that a house wrapped in soil could hold in warmth like a fist. So Elspeth made a fist around the house. It became a ritual: boil coffee, dig, pack mud, repeat. And when the neighbors passed by on sleigh or wagon, they never waved anymore. They just stared like she was already a ghost. Silas Mercer didn't just stare, he laughed. On the 4th day, when the walls were halfway swallowed by the thick brown mix of earth and straw, he rode up in his black-collared coat, hat tilted back, and called out like he was doing her a favor. "You burying it before or after the thaw?" he said, drawing chuckles from the 2 boys perched on the edge of his cart. Elspeth wiped her brow, tucked the shovel upright like a gravestone, and didn't reply. That only seemed to provoke him more. Silas dismounted, walking slow and deliberate across the frozen patch of grass, his boots loud on the crust of ice. James was a builder. He wouldn't have stood for this. That part cut deeper than the rest. Elspeth gritted her teeth and turned back to her work, pressing her hand flat against the newest section of packed mud, like she was sealing a wound. Behind her, Silas muttered, "Suit yourself. Some folks got to learn the hard way." She waited until his footsteps faded and his cartwheels creaked back onto the road before she let her shoulders fall. That night she drank her coffee cold and read James's last ledger twice over. The ink faded but still sharp. "Barley rope, 2 nails short of finish. Will fix." But he never had. The days blurred after that, each one colder than the last, with skies too clean, too blue, the kind of blue that whispered warning, not comfort. Elspeth finished the insulation wall on a Tuesday and started sleeping closer to it, just to feel the heat stay a little longer. Then came the letter. Folded tight and damp with snowmelt, it was slid under her door in the hand of Emma Rayburn, the schoolmistress. Emma's handwriting trembled across the page, but the message was clear. School would reopen next Monday. Governor's orders. Normalcy must be preserved, and working families needed their children safe and supervised. Elspeth stared at the words for a long time, her hands clutching the note like it might catch fire. She stepped outside with it, crossed the narrow path to her little barn, and sat by the stacked cords of wood until her eyes caught the sky again. Too calm, too bright. She'd seen this trick before. Snow lying in wait, hidden behind silence. And it wasn't fear she felt, but something worse, certainty. She lit her lamp, pulled out the remains of the old carriage tarp James had refused to throw out, and began to measure the distance from the schoolhouse to the closest shelter she could reach in under 2 minutes, the Brennan's barn. Building the corridor meant working in the dark. By then, the sun dipped before supper, and her evenings blurred into a litany of hauling, sawing, and tying by lantern light. She stole wood where she could. An unused fence rail behind the Blackwell place, leftover siding from the abandoned Loomis farm. She laid the boards low to the ground, securing them to a frame held together by twine, rope, and whatever nails she could pry from old chairs. Then came the tarp, stretched across the frame like skin over ribs. The wind bit at it constantly, testing her seams, but she reinforced it with layers of mud from her trench and grain sacks patched with needle and waxed thread. It wasn't beautiful, but it didn't need to be. She threaded a thick rope through the entire passageway, tying it off tight on each end like the riggings of a storm-battered ship. Children could hold onto it with both hands and feel their way through blind. Every knot she tied was for a name she remembered. William Brennan, Clara Bell, those two Knutson twins who always lost their mittens. She worked until her hands bled. And when Jacob Hardy offered help in secret, she refused, because she knew Silas would retaliate against him. It had to be hers alone. If it failed, no one else would fall with it. By Friday, word had gotten around. Silas stood outside the general store, chewing on a matchstick and shaking his head. "She's building a tunnel now," he said to no one in particular, but loud enough for ears to catch. "Next, she'll be raising barns out of feathers." No one laughed this time. Not even Charlie Peggs, who once mimicked Elspeth's limp behind her back. Maybe it was the way the wind shifted, or maybe folks were beginning to remember the last time a blizzard rolled in without warning. But Silas wouldn't back down. He walked right up to the schoolhouse on a Sunday afternoon, while Elspeth was inside, tying the final knot in the guide rope. "I'm telling you now," he barked, hands on his belt. "If one of those kids gets hurt in that thing, it's on your head." Elspeth stood, wiped her hands on her apron, and looked him in the eye for the first time in weeks. "If one of them dies because they couldn't find the door, that's on yours." They stared at each other for a long moment, the silence heavy as snow. Silas left without a word. That night, Emma slipped her a bundle of mittens to keep in the passage. Elspeth stitched names into them by the light of her lamp, one after the other, until the fabric blurred from her tears. Monday morning arrived with strange gentleness. The sky was high and flat, the air still. A few children arrived early, running up the schoolhouse steps with flushed cheeks and loose scarves. Their parents waved and returned home, grateful for the illusion of normalcy. Elspeth stood near the corridor, pretending to sweep snow away with a straw broom, though none had fallen. Inside her pocket was a folded scrap from the Bismarck Tribune, a short piece titled "Unseasonal Calm Over Plains." She crushed it slowly in her palm. Emma greeted her with a quiet nod, and together they walked through the corridor once, testing the rope's tension and stepping wide where the floor dipped. It held. The tarp flapped lightly overhead, but the wind hadn't found its voice yet. When Elspeth stepped back outside, she stared out at the open stretch beyond the hill, where the line between earth and sky blurred in brightness. There were no birds, no sound, just the stillness before something breaks. She exhaled slowly and turned back toward her home, the little house wrapped in its coat of earth. It looked absurd and small, but when she stepped inside, the air was warm. Not hot, but enough to matter. She poured herself coffee from the dented kettle, sat near the window, and waited. The morning had the kind of deceptive stillness that always came before something brutal. Elspeth stood by the rope corridor, her gloved fingers brushing over each knot she had tied by hand the week before. A few parents waved as they passed by, grateful to leave their children at the schoolhouse on time for once. "Be good for Miss Rayburn," one mother called out, pulling a scarf over her mouth as she turned her sled back toward the fields. No one brought extra blankets. Some of the younger boys arrived in thin jackets, the same ones they wore in fall. Elspeth watched them pile inside the schoolhouse, their laughter muffled by the thick wooden walls. She glanced down at her boots, still damp from the night's final patching of the tarp, and tugged the rope once more for tension. It held. Just past the ridge, the horizon shimmered too brightly, like a mirror held at the wrong angle. Emma came to stand beside her, arms crossed. "Feels wrong," she murmured. Elspeth nodded without turning. "It's quiet." That was all she said. A few minutes later she walked back toward her house, the Bismarck Tribune folded in her pocket, the headline still repeating in her head. "Calm continues over the plains. Mild week ahead." She'd seen calm like that before. It never stayed. By late morning, the wind came down like a knife. Not slowly, not with warning, just a sudden roar that slammed the back door of the schoolhouse and knocked over the milk pail. Emma was the first to react, shouting for the children to move away from the windows and reaching for the box of extra mittens Elspeth had prepared days earlier. Snow began to whip sideways across the narrow window panes. Visibility dropped to near nothing in a matter of seconds. Elspeth, across the field in her home, bolted upright from the small bench by her stove. She didn't bother with her coat. She wrapped her shawl tight and ran, barefoot inside her boots, slipping once on the frozen porch step. She reached the schoolhouse corridor by feel more than sight. The tarp screamed above her, flapping wildly in the wind, but the rope inside remained taut. She grabbed it, breathing hard, and opened the panel closest to the school door. Inside, children had already begun to cry. "We can't see the yard!" someone yelled. Emma appeared at the opening, face pale but steady. "We have to move now," Elspeth said. Emma nodded and began to herd them. One at a time, hands on the rope. The panic in the children's eyes shifted as Elspeth stepped into the tunnel, placing her back against the left side. "Stay on this side. Right hands on the rope, don't let go, one by one." It started with Clara Bell, the smallest of the group, barely 7. Elspeth held her hand until Clara found the rope, then gently moved her forward. Behind her came the Brennan twins, silent for the first time in living memory. Each child passed through the tunnel like it was a bridge to another world, one made of smoke and noise, where snow howled like wolves and breath felt like broken glass. The inside of the corridor was a blur of motion and fear. Emma called names from the schoolhouse end. Elspeth answered them as they emerged on the other side. "Clara's through," she shouted, voice cracking. "William's through." One by one, they came out of the tunnel and stumbled into the shelter of the barn, where Elspeth had spread grain sacks for warmth and kindled a fire that was already sputtering from wind sneaking through the slats. Mrs. Brennan had arrived by then, screaming the names of her children. Elspeth caught her by the shoulders. "They're safe, inside." It was too loud to explain, too late to calm anyone. She turned back and re-entered the corridor, her own fingers raw where the rope had burned them, heart pounding as if it too were tied to every knot. On the 5th trip through the tunnel, Emma called out with a voice that trembled now. That was the last of the roster. But Elspeth wasn't listening. She was counting by memory. Something itched at her, the strange silence between two names, a voice she hadn't heard, a face that hadn't come through. She turned and walked once more back toward the schoolhouse, holding the rope this time with her left hand, just to feel something different. She stepped inside and looked around. Desks were overturned. A mitten was caught in a crack on the floor. A scarf hung from a hook near the stove. The box was nearly empty. One pair remained. Elspeth picked it up. "Jacob," she whispered. "Jacob Dietz, 9 years old, always the last to speak, always hanging back." "Emma!" she shouted back through the corridor. "Jacob's not here!" Emma hesitated. "I called his name. He wasn't here when I counted." Elspeth didn't argue. She didn't accuse. She dropped the mittens, turned around, and gripped the rope again. "One more," she whispered to herself, and began the crawl back, this time against the wind that now felt angry, like it knew what she was doing. Outside the tunnel, the parents had gathered in a semicircle near the barn, watching with faces half covered and eyes wide. No one spoke. No one tried to follow her. Silas stood to the side, his arms folded tightly, expression unreadable. When Elspeth emerged again, carrying Jacob in her arms, face red from cold but breathing, several people cried out. One of the Knutson boys reached forward to help, but Elspeth shook her head and kept walking, her eyes fixed on the barn. She stepped inside, lowered Jacob near the fire, and sat with her back to the wall. Emma met her gaze. "You went back." It wasn't a question. Elspeth nodded once. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. "He wouldn't have made it," she murmured. Across the barn, the children huddled in blankets, watching her now with something new, something that wasn't pity. Mrs. Brennan came over and knelt beside her. "You saved them." Elspeth didn't respond. She stared down at the burns on her palms and thought only of the rope. It had held. Every knot had held, and for the first time since James's death, she felt something sharp and unfamiliar take root in her chest. Not pride, but a kind of peace. Outside, the wind kept screaming. The snow thickened until it blurred every line, turning fences into smudges and trees into ghosts. But the barn held, and the tunnel stood. No one dared question it now. The woman who had dug mud with her bare hands and packed straw like it was gold had seen what they hadn't, and in that seeing she had done what no man had managed that day, held back death long enough for children to pass through it, unharmed. When the last parent finally arrived, too late, stumbling through snow that reached his thighs, he fell to his knees at the barn entrance and cried without sound. Elspeth, seated near the fire, looked up only once. She counted the children again, mouthing each name silently. And when she reached the end, she whispered, "That's all of them." Then her fingers dropped from the rope, and her body finally let go of its fight. She sank slowly back against the straw wall, eyes open, heart steady, not from exhaustion, but from knowing the thing she built was not a madness. It had become memory, and it had worked. Elspeth didn't think, she just went. Her body moved before her mind could make sense of what she was doing, pulled forward not by panic, but by a thread of instinct so old it didn't need language. Re-entering the corridor felt like stepping backward through time, back into the weight of earth, grief, and something deeper still. The tarp above her strained under the wind's fists, the ropes vibrating in her grip like a held breath. Inside, the air was damp, close, almost too still. Her fingers slid over each knot along the guiding cord, the one she had tied with cracked skin, and whispered names. Halfway through, she caught a glimmer, a figure huddled near the far end of the tunnel, unmoving. "Jacob," she called softly, crouching low. The boy's eyes blinked slowly, unfocused, his body curled like a leaf in frost. She reached him, wrapping her arms around his tiny frame, but before she could rise, another sound broke through, the shifting of boots. She turned sharply, and there, pressed against the tarp wall like gilt-made flesh, was Silas Mercer. No coat, just his undershirt and vest clinging to him, sleeves damp, one hand bloodied. He opened his mouth, but the words fumbled, caught between pride and collapse. "You shouldn't be here," Elspeth said, voice low but firm, tightening her hold around Jacob. Silas's reply came slow, dragging shame with it. "I didn't follow the boy. I ran. I couldn't see. I thought I knew better." His eyes flicked to the rope above, then to the knots beneath her hand. "You were right," he said, the words breaking like ice underfoot. "And I needed you to be wrong, not out of spite, out of fear, because if you were right, it meant I wasn't who they think I am." Elspeth didn't speak. She studied him, this man who had mocked her in the open and now stood hunched like a child who had broken something irreparable. He had always held power in silence, in posture, in knowing when to speak and when not to. But here, in the half-dark of a tunnel meant to save lives, stripped of his authority and his image, he looked ordinary. Mortal. She nodded once, a signal without judgment, then turned. "Take his hand," she said, not looking back. "We're going." Silas hesitated only a second before he obeyed, his fingers brushing Jacob's with a tremble neither of them acknowledged. The three of them moved slowly, pressed shoulder to shoulder against the left side of the corridor, Jacob between them. Elspeth guided with her free hand on the rope, counting each knot like steps in a ritual. Jacob didn't speak. His small hand clung to Silas's coat, eyes still blank with the aftershock of nearly being left behind. The rope sagged near the middle, the tarp above groaning where it had loosened. Silas reached up instinctively, trying to steady it, and Elspeth heard him mutter under his breath, "How did you hold this together alone?" She didn't answer. She focused instead on the breathing, on the pace, on making each footstep land where it needed to. When they finally emerged into the light of the barn, there were no cheers, just gasps. Emma rushed forward, taking Jacob into her arms, burying his face in her shoulder. The others stepped aside. Silas stood behind Elspeth now, not beside her. She didn't make a show of anything. She simply turned, walked back to her house with the same steadiness she used to shovel mud, and entered without ceremony, carrying only the silence of a life that had earned its warmth. Inside the mud-lined house, the air was thick with slow heat. It wasn't the fire that warmed, it was the insulation holding in every ounce of effort she'd buried into the walls. Elspeth set down her gloves on the table and lowered herself to the chair beside the stove, where the kettle from that morning still sat, half full and stubbornly warm. She didn't cry immediately. Her hands trembled from cold and effort, but her face stayed still. Only when she reached into the drawer below the stove, the one where James's final note remained folded inside a ledger, did the first tear fall. She unfolded the slip of paper. It was faded, barely legible. "Don't forget the rope. Strongest tool we own." He'd written it after repairing their ox harness 2 winters before he died, but it felt like prophecy now. She smiled without joy, then let the tears come freely. Not from fear, not even from exhaustion, just from knowing that for once she had done something that stayed standing. Something that had held. A knock at the door broke the moment. She wiped her eyes and opened it. No words, just Silas, holding out a sack of flour and a folded page with shaky handwriting. He placed them on her table, nodded once, and left. The page wasn't long. A single paragraph written on the back of a receipt from Mercer and Sons Grain Exchange, dated 3 weeks prior. It was a statement of reallocation, signed by Silas, transferring 1/3 of his winter credit to 5 families listed below, including the Brennans, the Rayburns, and the Knutsons. A handwritten line at the bottom read, "They would have frozen. You gave them a way through." Elspeth sat down slowly. She placed the contract next to James's note, pressing her palm gently over both. There was no forgiveness in the gesture, only recognition. Silas had not changed overnight, but something had cracked, and cracks let in light, if you let them. The next weeks passed in quiet recovery. Children returned to their routines. Parents stopped looking at her sideways. The tunnel remained standing, its rope still tied tight, as a reminder no one mocked anymore. When Emma came by with Jacob a month later, his hand firmly in hers, Elspeth asked the question before she could talk herself out of it. "Has anyone taken him in?" Emma shook her head. "Not yet." Elspeth didn't hesitate. "He can stay here, if he wants." Jacob looked up at her, then at the stove, and nodded without speaking. When the frost finally began to leave the ground and the fences reappeared under the melting snow, Elspeth stood outside with Jacob, now with a new pair of boots too big for him. Together, they swept the old path clean, the one leading from the barn to the schoolhouse. She had promised herself she wouldn't raise a child again, not without James, not alone. But survival changes its shape when it brushes against love. She hadn't saved Jacob out of duty. She had gone back because something in his absence had threatened to undo all she had stitched together. And now, watching him trace the outline of a rope with his boot heel, she understood what that meant. Family wasn't blood. It was choice repeated through action. That night, she placed the contract and James's note into the back of the ledger, tying it with twine. Then she placed it into a wooden box beneath the bed, next to Jacob's scarf and the spare pair of mittens she had stitched his name into. Her house still looked like a half-buried shack from the outside, patched and strange. But inside, it held. And for the first time, it wasn't just Elspeth, it was keeping warm. What did Elspeth's story stir in you? Tell us in the comments. We read everyone. If this touched your heart, please like and subscribe. It truly helps us keep creating these carefully crafted stories for you. And when you're done, explore another video here on the channel. Your time with us means more than you know.